Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Sideeq Mohammed. I'm a lecturer at Kent Business School, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the works of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari and how they help us to think about organizations. Now you're probably saying to yourself, Sideeq, I thought business schools were basically glorified trade colleges where managers picked up transferable or employable job skills. Most of the time that's true. However, since the 1980s, a number of organizational scholars have been interested to draw upon works of philosophy, critical theory, in order to construct more robust and insightful modes of thinking about contemporary organizations and how they function within the context of capitalism. A number of philosophers have been quite popular in this context, including Michel Foucault or various authors within the Frankfurt School like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse. My interest, however, is with Deleuze and Guattari. Here they are, two wonderful-looking gentlemen. Deleuze was born in 1925 in France, and he went on to study philosophy at the University of Paris-Sorbonne. In the process of doing so, he published a number of books, beginning with his work on David Hume, progressing to an interest on Friedrich Nietzsche, and eventually covering a large portion of the pantheon of the history of philosophy, including Spinoza, Bergson, and Kant. Guattari, born in 1930, was a psychoanalyst who trained under Jacques Lacan and eventually went on to work at La Borde Clinique, an experimental center for radical therapy that sought to disorganize the traditional relationship between therapist and patient by having both parties work and live together. These two met in 1968, that tumultuous period of French history, and began collaborating on a number of books, the first of which is Anti-Oedipus, published in 1972. They went on to write further texts, but Anti-Oedipus is really where we can start to see the beginnings of a radical reimagining of philosophy, one where we reject many dominant modes of thinking or imagining of how the social world works in order to pay attention to philosophical concepts. In 1980, they published 1,000 Plateaus, a text which would come to prefigure their lifelong preoccupation with the question of concepts. I will say more about this shortly, but for me, understanding what a concept is, how it functions, and what it can do for us in terms of thinking is one of the main contributions that Deleuze and Guattari can make to our understanding of organizations. Let's try and concretize this. So let's say that you're a researcher interested in understanding a shopping center. You might, for example, decide that you want to send out a questionnaire to various people in the shopping center or administer it by standing at the door. This will give you lots of data that you can use, programs to analyze, etc., etc. But another researcher might say that that is too narrow a picture of organization, that it presents it in too sterile a way, that organizations are kind of messy and complicated. So you might decide instead to do some interviews, to talk to some people in organizations. But if you've ever been randomly asked a question about what it's like to work where you work, you'll know exactly how difficult it can be to try and answer, to try and formulate a coherent thought about what it's like. So, another researcher might say, if we're going to study organizations, we need to do so ethnographically. We need to embed ourselves in the organization. We need to participate in the mores of its social life. We need to observe the various goings-on, various rituals, habits, practices, daily routines, etc., in order to make sense of what the organization is doing, how life is there, and so on. So let's say you start studying your organization, your shopping center, ethnographically. You start paying attention to all of the various comings and goings. You note cleaners going about their daily routines. You note various gatherings of people, from mall walkers who come to the shopping center to do some exercise, to a group of dancers who meet once a week or once a fortnight to practice their dancing in the shopping center's food court. You might note various routines and rituals around the buses, around cleaning, around fountains, and so on. As you do so, you begin to become preoccupied with the question of time. Time, as we know, has been a very interesting question for philosophers, so there's no shortage of writing and theorization about time. But when we look at all of the wealth of research on time, we see that it tends to fall into, broadly speaking, and forgive me the overgeneralization, two camps. One which might tell us that time is objective. Time is something that is measurable. This is where a physicist might sit. And if you asked a physicist about time, they might tell you that, well, time is based on a very, very precise system of measurement. We calculate a second as 1192,631,700 cycles of the alternation of two states of cesium-133. I think we can all agree that that is a mode of thinking about time that is pretty far divorced from how we might experience it. And this is where the second theorization of time might come in. An understanding of time as lived experience, as how you and I might think about or feel it. But even this falls under certain limitations in that it is a prefigured way of thinking about time that legitimates our own perceptions of ourselves. This is where Deleuze and Guattari can be quite interesting, because what they tell us, or what they suggest to us, is that we need to pay attention to concepts. A concept, for Deleuze and Guattari, is a tool. It's a mode of thinking or understanding experience. For them, philosophy is about creating, inventing, and fabricating concepts so that we can understand the world in which we live and the things which we do in it. There are two important things that we need to understand about how Deleuze and Guattari think about concepts. The first is that a concept has both a history and a becoming. A concept has a history, a number of uses, old connections, forms of sense or interpretation to which it was subjected, But more importantly, it has a becoming. Concepts are always changing. They're always becoming something new, something different. This is at once difficult to understand and fairly common to our experience. Language itself is always changing, and we might understand language as being made up of concepts, but often we like things to be stable or fixed. So the idea that a concept might change continuously is difficult. And so when we think about concepts, we thus arrive at the second thing that we need to be attentive to. A concept is always growing, evolving, and connecting based on the milieu in which it exists. It is always changing. It is immanent to a context. So, to return to our example, what might a concept tell us about time in the shopping center? How might we immanently understand time in the shopping center? What we might do is pay attention to various connections, things that seem disparate, different, difficult to grasp, unconnected, random, strange, surreal, pataphysical. We might observe a number of people dancing in the shopping center's food court. They dance a waltz, but it's a strange waltz because it's one that seems to at once sit discordantly with the shopping center's own natural rhythms, while also seeming to be well monitored. If you've ever tried to dance a rubato waltz, you'll know how absurd it is. And so what we have is a situation where ethnographically, trying to study or express time in the shopping center, if we do so immanently by trying to build up a concept, we might begin to think about time in the shopping center, not as objective and measured by a scientist, or as subjective and about our experience, but as a rubato waltz. This seems strange. Let me see if I can't add some context. The synesthetic consideration of time as a rubato waltz opens the door for us to turn our attention from traditional concerns, routines, and entrenched habit in order to see time as red or blue, or sometimes a black-blue-gray. Feel it as a texture, perhaps jagged or sanded. Taste it as everything from sweet to savory. Hear it as music, whether harmonious or discordant in the key of B flat, which functions as the ambient tone for the shopping center itself. Smell it in different possibilities, from ripe and pungent to as fresh and clean as the bathrooms after the 9 a.m. cleaning. Feel it when it begins to tremble or heat up with the frenzied air of the crowd gathered to see the Christmas lights being turned on. When I was studying the shopping center, which I did for my PhD, these kinds of surreal, pataphysical descriptions were the only ways I could try and articulate what that experience was like. I had to come up with a concept, the rubato waltz, in order to try and make any sense of what was going on. Brian Masumi, I think, says that a concept is like a brick. You can use it to build the courthouse of reason or throw it out the window. I don't know how useful a rebuttal waltz is for thinking about organization, but it is an interesting house to live in. I've been interested for some time in a fairly simple question. Why do people act against their own best interests? Why might somebody who is dependent upon European imports vote for Brexit? Why might an organization, knowing the dangers that it poses to the environment, continue to produce single-use plastics or refuse to reduce its carbon footprint? Why might an individual work for 70+ hours a week or come to work when they're ill? Why might we do these things? What Deleuze and Guattari propose that we think about, or what I read them as provoking us to think about, is something radically different from how we typically explain things in organization studies. If you asked an organizational scholar to explain these things, they might tell you that it's the institutional conditions. We need to pay attention to the mores of contemporary capitalism, to the way in which it breeds insecurity, or to the way in which it drives us to always push for greater and higher profits in the legitimation of greed, or the way in which it keeps individuals economically disenfranchised so that they have to work this hard. Deleuze and Guattari propose or provoke us to think about something very different. In Anti-Oedipus, they draw on the work of psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich in order to develop a more robust theorization of desire. Here's what they say. Reich is at his most profound as a thinker when he refuses to accept ignorance or illusion on the part of the masses as an explanation for fascism, and demands an explanation that will take their desires into account. An explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point and under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism. And it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. Why might we want fascism? It seems strange. It seems an absurd and scary idea. Who wants fascism? Surely fascism is something that a few bad individuals do to the rest of us, right? It's not something that we all want secretly. This is where Deleuze and Guattari via Reich are very provocative. And here we have to understand exactly how important a statement this is, because for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is something liberatory. It's not a lack. It's not a form of suffering. It's a productive, generative force that is always forming new connections, making new lines, figuring new ways of thinking and being, and becoming. So for desire to desire fascism, to desire annihilation or destruction, is a very provocative thing. What Deleuze and Guattari are encouraging us to reflect on is our complicity in fascist formations. We want it. We like it. They suggest that the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point and under certain conditions, they wanted fascism. Now, how does this help us to think about organizations? At a certain point and under certain conditions, we might desire to act against our best interests. We might vote for Brexit when we're an organization who depends on European imports. We might continue to parasite off the environment, or we might continue to work for extremely long hours, engaging ourselves in self-destructive behaviors thereby. Understanding this perversion, or understanding how desire can become so controlled, so codified, so colonized that it begins to desire its own repression, is, I think, core to the ways in which Deleuze and Guattari can help us to reflect on contemporary organizational practice. There's a number of ways in which we can think about Deleuze and Guattari. For me, the main thing that they can do, or they can add for us, is ways of thinking that are different. Different ways of thinking about the body, about time, about our experiences, about concepts, and about the things that we do. And sometimes it only takes a little bit of thinking differently to make a difference. Thank you.